Christopher Nolan is my favourite feature film director. I won't try to hide it. Some of his fans have developed something of a reputation over the years, so in an attempt to avoid association with some of those devotees who will mindlessly praise anything he does, I'm usually somewhat coy in admitting how much I enjoy his films. But the truth is, in my opinion, he's yet to make a bad film. Interstellar is my favourite film of all time. To me, it strikes a perfect balance of interesting concepts which are totally unique to film, with emotion and suspense. The set pieces were all stunning and felt incredibly natural within the story world. There were so many moments which had me on the edge of my seat, and although some critics have argued it was a predictable story, I found some of the twists and turns to be genuinely surprising. It was massively entertaining, but also left me thinking about the state of the world. I liked that it all felt grounded, as though the events in the film could actually happen. The spaceships used were beautifully designed and felt faithful to current spacecraft while simultaneously appearing a little futuristic. It goes without saying that the film looks and sounds amazing. But today I'm not going to talk only about Interstellar, and I'll refrain from gushing over his other films as much as possible. Today I want to talk primarily about one of the criticisms Nolan's recent films have faced, particularly with regards to Tenet, but I think it permeates most of his filmography. I will also discuss why I think in some cases this criticism is actually a strength. I'm talking, of course, of his prioritisation of concepts over characters. I think it's a fair assessment to suggest that Nolan is one of the most popular directors working in Hollywood today. Since the success of the Dark Knight trilogy, and critically Inception, his name has developed into a brand much like Spielberg, Tarantino, Scorsese, and a handful of other auteur directors. He has become a household name, which is a rare thing for a director. If you would indulge in self-reference, you, as a viewer of this channel, are likely to be very interested in the film world, and could probably name dozens of film directors. However, it's sometimes difficult to remember that the vast majority of filmgoers who aren't tuned into the behind-the-scenes world of filmmaking could probably only name a small handful of directors. The fact that my parents, who enjoy watching films but not necessarily the area of film studies I engage with, know who Nolan is, and decided to watch both Dunkirk and Tenet from Nolan's name alone, is testament to the extent to which he has entered the cultural zeitgeist. If that anecdotal evidence wasn't enough, just look at the box office numbers for his films. Dunkirk, Interstellar and Inception, none of which were based on any previous intellectual property, all grossed over $500 million worldwide. Tenet, despite the current situation, has so far as of the time of writing grossed over $200 million worldwide, and under normal circumstances it would have been projected to perform similarly to Inception. He is one of just a few creative forces in Hollywood that is able to regularly secure financing for and produce original blockbuster films. No matter your stance on his films, it's hard not to admit that what he's been able to do within the contemporary studio system is impressive. What then has made his films so popular and accessible to general audiences? I think the answer to this lies in how they are presented. His films are generally brimming with interesting ideas and concepts. Even Dunkirk, arguably one of his simplest from a narrative perspective, is a fresh take on the war genre due to the differing timescales for the three main situations in the film. His first mainstream commercial success, Batman Begins, also relied on one of these key concepts to generate interest, which was, what if Batman was placed in the real world in the 21st century? Previous screen adaptations of the character had been much more cartoon-esque in their presentation. That's not to say they weren't devoid of darker moments, but the worlds of the Burton Batman and the 1960s TV show were not particularly grounded. Nolan's trilogy revitalised the DC film franchise and introduced a new generation of fans to the Batman characters. What I think Nolan does expertly is package these unique concepts and visual ideas into the format of a traditional American blockbuster. Compared to some more cerebral filmmakers, and certainly compared to a lot of independent or international cinema, Nolan's films are actually incredibly accessible. Although they're more challenging and perhaps sometimes more intellectually stimulating than anything else contemporary Hollywood has to offer, they are still, at their core, blockbusters. To take Inception, Interstellar and Tenet as obvious examples, these are films which ultimately revolve around one key concept, be it the idea of infiltrating a person's dreams, travelling through a wormhole and witnessing firsthand the effects of time dilation, or having the ability to move inverted through time. These concepts are, generally, unique to the medium of film, or at least unique in the way by which Nolan depicts them, and I think that even though these films are accessible to general audiences, they do still require you to engage with the film on a higher level than some other blockbuster fare. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that this means his films are better than typical blockbusters, and I think that there is a good case for films that you can watch while proverbially turning your brain off. However, films which rely on concepts such as these do command your attention in a way that some other mainstream films do not. And this is the challenge that the Nolan brand faces. He has garnered a reputation amongst moviegoers as this cerebral, intellectually challenging filmmaker, when in reality, he's just a blockbuster director. He's an incredibly proficient one at that, and there's no denying his passion for cinema as an art form. And as discussed, I think it's commendable that he's been able to produce these original high-concept blockbusters in a time when Hollywood relies ever more heavily on franchise filmmaking. It's great that these types of films have been able to reach a mass audience. What I'm about to suggest doesn't change the fact that he's my favourite film director, or that he's responsible for some of my favourite films of all time, but I think it's an important thing to say. His films are not flawless. And so because his films have been, in my opinion and the opinions of many other filmgoers, so consistently good, as a filmmaker who's been put on this pedestal by some audiences, therefore when he releases a film like Tenet, which has had a much more mixed critical reception than some of his other films, I think some reviewers are keen to judge his films more harshly than they perhaps deserve. Now, I really enjoyed Tenet. I did think it was perhaps one of his weaker films, but as I say, I don't think he's made a bad movie yet. Yet, I think some of its critics have been overly harsh, and in some areas have possibly missed what Nolan was aiming to achieve with this film, and indeed with some of his other films, most notably Dunkirk. Nolan is a big screen director through and through. If you watch any interview with him, his passion for cinema becomes immediately clear. And so something I think he's strived to do in his own films is maximise the potential of the big screen experience. His films have been visual and auditory masterpieces, partly due to his ability to realise fantastical concepts on screen, and partly due to his insistence on realising those concepts practically. Being able to see inside of a dream, or visit other worlds and travel through wormholes, or see time inversion in such an immersive way, is arguably a significant reason why mass audiences flock to see his films. The marketing of his movies also emphasises this part of his films, suggesting that they are must-see cinematic experiences, and I would agree with that. His films are totally designed to be seen on as big a screen as possible. The scope of Pfister or Van Hoytema's photography, coupled with the typical percussion-based Zimmer or Köranzen score, completely immerse you when there are no distractions. This is of course entirely subjective, but I find his set pieces unparalleled in this regard. The docking scene from Interstellar, the Spitfire dogfights in Dunkirk, and the Siberia inversion battle in Tenet remain some of my favourite experiences in the cinema. Full Fat Videos recently made a video called Tenet: The Situation Is Enough. Now, I've deliberately avoided watching it so far because I suspect from the title he may have already discussed some of the points I'm about to make, so I do apologise if there is a bit of overlap. But his title perfectly encapsulates my sentiment. His films, certainly Tenet and Dunkirk, do tend to prioritise the depiction of concepts and themes in broad strokes over more minute character arcs. For a lot of stories, it's absolutely vital to have meaningful and recognisable character arcs, and certainly that's the issue a lot of his detractors take with his movies. But I do think that in bringing these amazing concepts to life on the big screen, that is enough to sustain and validate your enjoyment from the film. Characters like the protagonist and Tommy serve entirely as audience surrogates, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially when navigating new and complex worlds. This is not to say that their characters don't have drives and motivations, but they're very broad and empathetic. Tommy, as a young and war-weary soldier, is desperate to go home, and so his actions throughout the film are in service of that goal. The protagonist is a more savvy character, but he has a similarly basic drive in that he seeks to firstly understand the world of inversion and stop a world-ending threat, and also save the woman he comes to love from the clutches of Sato, the gangster hell-bent on destroying humanity. They are simple enough drives, but universal enough to be immediately understood by the audience. Slightly more complex Nolan characters like Cobb, Cooper and Bruce Wayne can also be broken down into simple drives, be it wanting to go home and finally see his children again, wanting to save his children from certain death, or wipe out the corruption that led to his parents' death and make his home city a safer place for everyone. When reduced to these terms, none of these characters are particularly complicated, but they don't have to be. As discussed, Nolan produces blockbuster films, technically proficient high-concept films, but blockbuster films all the same. And the appeal of the blockbuster isn't its ability to interrogate nuanced character actions, it's because they're entertaining and highlight some kind of spectacle that just can't be achieved in another medium. But even with all that in mind, I don't think it's fair to dismiss his entire filmography as cold and devoid of emotion. He's still able to craft scenes that tug on the heartstrings by establishing these simple character drives. And because these motivations are so universal, it's very easy to find empathy with his characters and to root for them. Tenet I would perhaps make an exception for in that regard because I did find it very cold and detached, but the cinematic spectacle and following the protagonist on his journey of discovery into this strange world was enough for me to find great enjoyment from the film. But there is a huge spread of characters from his films that I think are incredibly emotionally engaging for the above reason. I think ultimately it boils down to personal taste. Now, I really like the cold style of filmmaking Nolan presents, but I found that he can typically balance the outlandish concepts with interesting characters by simply reducing the character motivations to universal desires. Regardless on your stance on his films, I think it is impressive that a filmmaker like Nolan is able to produce these high-budget original concept films and still reach a mass audience given the main franchise-oriented drives of the contemporary industry. I'd be curious to hear what you all think about Nolan and his filmography in the comments below. This video was influenced more by my personal bias than I perhaps would have liked, but after Tenet I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about his films in slightly more depth. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and considered subscribing for more. But until next time, thanks.